The merciless August sun of 1885 beat down on Willow Springs like the devil's own forge, turning the dusty main street into a shimmering furnace that made the air dance with heat waves. The ramshackle buildings seemed to wilt under the assault, their weathered boards creaking and groaning as the wood expanded in the relentless heat. Inside the cramped sheriff's office, the stifling atmosphere was thick with tobacco smoke and the acrid smell of unwashed bodies, while flies buzzed lazily around a half-empty whiskey bottle perched on the grimy windowsill. Sheriff Claude Thorne, a hulking man of 50 with steel-gray eyes and hands scarred from decades of violence, leaned back in his creaking chair with the satisfied expression of a predator, savoring its cornered prey. His silver badge caught the harsh light streaming through the dirt-streaked window, but the gleam seemed more like mockery than justice. A prop in a theater of corruption where law served only those willing to pay for it. The office itself bore testament to his character. Wanted posters hung askew on the walls, some with bullet holes through the faces, while a collection of confiscated weapons displayed like trophies spoke of encounters that had ended badly for those who opposed him. Before his battered desk stood Helene Miller, 22 years old and trembling despite her fierce efforts to maintain composure. Her golden hair, usually pinned in a neat bun, befitting a respectable young woman, had come loose during her ordeal, framing a face that bore the unmistakable marks of recent brutality. Dark purple bruises encircled her slender throat like a grotesque necklace, and when she attempted to speak, only a strangled whisper emerged from her damaged vocal cords. Her simple blue cotton dress, the same one she had worn 3 days ago to meet her beloved Robert at their secret place by Owl Canyon, was torn at the shoulder and stained with desert dust and dried blood. The fabric still carried traces of the jasmine water she had splashed on her wrists that morning, when her greatest worry had been whether her hair looked pretty enough for her fiancé's proposal. Now those innocent concerns seemed like memories from another lifetime, erased by violence and terror, that had transformed her understanding of the world's capacity for cruelty. Monsieur, well now, darlin'. Thorne's voice carried the lazy cruelty of a predator toying with wounded prey, each syllable dripping with false solicitude that made his true intentions all the more terrifying. Seems you've lost your voice at the most inconvenient time. But don't you fret none, I've got just the cure for what ails you. He pushed a crumpled document across the scarred wooden surface with one thick, dirty finger, the nail black with accumulated grime. This here's a marriage contract that'll solve all your problems. Think of it as medical treatment for what's troubling your delicate constitution. The paper bore the name Edmund Fitzroy, written in Thorne's crude handwriting, one of the many false identities used by his business partner for their increasingly profitable enterprises. The ink was still wet in places, suggesting the document had been prepared hastily once Thorne realized he had a problem that needed immediate resolution. Helene's green eyes widened with horror as she read the terms, which essentially transferred ownership of her person and property to a phantom created to legitimize what amounted to human slavery. Deputy Marcus Webb shifted nervously near the door, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard against the bile rising in his throat. The brass buttons on his vest were tarnished, and his badge sat crooked on his chest, as if he couldn't bear to wear it properly. Sheriff, maybe we should what Marcus Thorne's tone turned silky with implied threat, the kind of voice a snake might use if it could speak. Should let this poor, traumatized woman wander the territory alone and defenseless. What kind of lawmen would that make us know, sir? We're gonna see she's properly taken care of, like any decent Christian men would do for a soul in distress. Webb's hand rested unsteadily on his gun belt fingers, drumming against the leather with barely contained anxiety. Every few seconds, his gaze would drift toward the window, as if expecting to see something or someone approaching through the heat-shimmered streets. His voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with the stifling heat. It's just, she don't seem willing, Sheriff. The law says a woman's got to consent to marriage even in circumstances like these. Maybe if we gave her time to consider, willing. Thorne's laugh was like gravel grinding in a bucket, harsh and grating against the ears. Boy, sometimes what's best for folks ain't what they think they want at the moment. That's why the Lord gave men wisdom to make the hard decisions for the weaker sex. This girl's clearly addled by her recent difficulties. Once she's settled into married life with a strong man to guide her, she'll thank us for our foresight and Christian charity. He rose from his chair with deliberate slowness, his considerable bulk casting a shadow across Helene's trembling form. Besides, a mute woman makes for a peaceful household, don't you think? No nagging, no backtalk, just quiet obedience like the good book intended. Mr. Fitzroy's getting himself quite a bargain. But Webb's nervous energy and the conversation's increasingly sinister tone had not gone unnoticed by keen eyes watching from outside. Through the office's partially open door, which allowed the evening breeze to carry in the scent of creosote and distant wood smoke, a pair of dark eyes observed every movement with the intensity of a hunting hawk studying its prey. Dasan, a Chiricahua Apache warrior of 28 summers, crouched in the lengthening shadows beside the building, his weathered buckskin shirt bearing no ornament, save a single golden eagle feather braided into his long black hair. His face bore the weathered lines of a man who had spent his entire adult life under the desert sun, fighting for his people's survival against forces that seemed determined to erase them from the earth. Scars crisscrossed his forearms, souvenirs from battles with cavalry sabers and desperate hand-to-hand struggles where victory meant life and defeat meant death for entire families. His dark eyes held the steady patience of someone who had learned to wait for exactly the right moment to strike, combined with the burning intensity of a warrior who had never accepted defeat as permanent. He had ridden into Willow Springs, following disturbing reports from tribal scouts. Armed white men had been seen polluting the sacred spring at Owl Canyon, with their presence dumping refuse and worse into waters that his people had considered holy for generations beyond memory. Stolen Army rifles were being moved through traditional Apache hunting grounds under cover of darkness, disrupting the delicate balance that allowed his tribe to survive in their hidden canyon strongholds. The territorial authorities seemed either unwilling or unable to investigate these violations, leaving his people to defend themselves against an encroachment that threatened both their physical survival and their spiritual connection to the land their ancestors had walked since time immemorial. See Miss Miller. Thorne continued moving around the desk, with the calculated grace of a man who had learned to use his size and presence as weapons of intimidation. You witnessed some unfortunate events out at Owl Canyon that could cause considerable embarrassment to certain upstanding citizens of this territory. Now, being a reasonable man with a Christian heart, I understand your distress. Violent death can be mighty unsettling to delicate feminine sensibilities, especially when it involves someone you held dear. He paused beside her chair close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and the stale sweat that permeated his unwashed clothes. But here's the beauty of your current condition. Can't nobody expect coherent testimony from a woman who can't speak above a whisper? And a married woman, well, she's got herself a husband to do her talking, for her to make the important decisions and handle all that complicated legal business. It's what the good book intended, really. Man, as the head woman, as the helpmate, everything in its proper order. Helene tried desperately to form words, her damaged voice managing only the faintest whisper that barely carried across the small room. Robert, he never... Please, you don't understand. Oh, but your dear departed Robert was a meddlesome sort. Thorne said with mock sympathy, his thick fingers closing around her wrist like a steel manacle. Always poking around where he had no business, asking questions that showed a disturbing lack of respect for his betters and the natural order of things. Some might say he brought his misfortune upon himself through prideful curiosity and failure to understand his proper place in society. Webb's face had gone pale, as parchment beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the late hour. Sheriff, you said it was an accident that Keller fell into the mine shaft while he was working his claim. You filed a report with the territorial office stating, "Accidents happen when folks don't mind their own affairs, Deputy." Thorne's voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the tone of a man who had never been successfully challenged and expected never to be. Young Keller thought he was smarter than the established order, thought his little education and his fancy mining techniques gave him the right to judge his superiors and question their methods. Well, the territory's a mite safer now that such dangerous thinking has been corrected. The casual admission of murder hit Webb like a physical blow, and his hand trembled as it moved toward his weapon. The deputy had harbored suspicions about Robert Keller's death. The body had been found too far from any mine shaft, and the wounds were inconsistent with a simple fall. But hearing Thorne's brazen confession transformed suspicion into horrifying certainty. "Careful now, Marcus." Thorne's cold gaze stopped Webb before he could complete any foolish gesture of conscience. "Wouldn't want you to do something that might endanger those precious grandchildren of yours. Little Emma and Samuel, ain't it such sweet children playing in their grandmother's garden without a care in the world? Be a terrible shame if something happened to interrupt their well-being." The threat hung in the air, like poison gas paralyzing Webb, with the knowledge that his moment of moral courage could cost innocent lives. His daughter Sarah had married a good man, who worked hard at the general store trying to build a decent life for their small family. The children were everything to him, bright-eyed Emma with her love of wildflowers, and little Samuel who followed his grandfather around like a devoted puppy whenever Webb visited their small homestead outside town. You see, Marcus understands the importance of family. Thorne continued with oily satisfaction. Understands that sometimes a man's got to swallow his pride and do what's necessary to protect the ones he loves. Ain't that right, Deputy? Webb's voice came out as barely more than a croak. Yes, sir. Whatever you say, Sheriff. That was the moment when Dasan chose to act his warrior's instinct, recognizing that words had given way to immediate physical threat, and that hesitation would cost innocent lives. The office door exploded inward with a thunderous crash that sent Deputy Webb stumbling backward into the wall, his hand instinctively reaching for his holstered pistol but freezing halfway there as he found himself staring into the barrel of a Winchester rifle held with rock-steady precision by hands that had never known doubt in combat. Dasan filled the doorway, like an avenging spirit risen from the desert itself, his dark eyes blazing with controlled fury that seemed to draw all the air from the small room. Everything about his bearing spoke of a man who had been tested in the crucible of warfare and emerged victorious the economical way he moved, without wasted motion. The casual competence with which he handled his weapon, as if it were an extension of his own body. The absolute stillness that preceded violence, like the calm before a tornado strikes. Step away from the woman. He said quietly, his English precise, despite the slight accent that marked him as someone for whom it was not a native tongue. Each word carried the weight of absolute certainty, the tone of a man who had made his final decision and would not be swayed by argument or threat. "Do this now!" Thorne's hand dropped to his gun belt, but his voice maintained its mocking tone, even in the face of mortal danger, years of unchallenged authority making him believe his own invincibility. "Well, looky here, we got ourselves a noble savage come calling. Tell me, boy, you speak for all the red men in these parts, or just the ones stupid enough to stick their noses in white men's business where they don't belong?" "I speak for those who cannot speak." Dasan replied, his rifle never wavering from its target, despite Thorne's obvious preparation for violence. "For those whose voices have been stolen by men who call themselves lawmen, but serve only their own greed. Stand aside. Now that's mighty philosophical for a heathen." Thorne sneered, but there was a note of uncertainty creeping into his voice as he recognized something dangerous in the Apache's absolute calm. "Problem is this, here's official law business conducted under the authority of my duly appointed badge. I don't recall deputizing any Apache to assist in my duties or question my methods. Your badge means nothing when worn by a murderer. Destined said simply the truth of his words, cutting through Thorn's bluster like a knife through rotted leather. Honor cannot be bought or stolen, it must be earned through right action. In one fluid motion that spoke of years of combat experience and countless hours of practice, Destined crossed the small room. With the speed of a striking rattlesnake, swept Helene up in his powerful arms and spun toward the window. His movements flowed together, seamlessly, each action flowing naturally into the next without pause or hesitation. But as he prepared to carry her to safety, Webb's agonized voice cracked with desperation and shame. "Wait, please, he has my family, my grandbabies. They'll kill them if I don't. I can't let them die because of my cowardice." The words struck Destined like a physical blow as he realized the full scope of the trap that had been laid for decent people throughout the territory. Webb's nervous behavior, his reluctant cooperation, his haunted expression, it all made sense now. This was not a willing accomplice, but another victim forced into compliance through threats against the innocent lives he held most dear. "Your grandbabies ain't the only ones at stake here, Marcus," Thorn said with silky menace, drawing his Colt with practiced ease despite the rifle pointed at his chest. "Seems we got us a situation that requires some delicate handling and careful consideration of consequences." But Destined was already moving, his warrior's training taking over as he calculated angles and distances with the speed of thought. He kicked out the wooden window frame with his moccasin-clad foot, the glass exploding outward in a shower of sharp fragments that caught the evening light like scattered diamonds. Without pause, he dropped through the opening, with Helene cradled protectively in his arms, landing with cat-like grace beside his magnificent white Appaloosa horse that waited motionless in the narrow alley. The animal was a testament to Apache horse-breeding skill, compact, but powerful, with the intelligent eyes of a creature trained for warfare and the steady nerves necessary to remain calm under fire. Its white coat bore the ritual paint marks that identified it as a war horse of significant status, while the simple rope halter spoke of the deep bond between rider and mount that made conventional tack unnecessary. "Stop right there, you red devil!" Thorn's voice cracked like a bullwhip as he appeared at the destroyed window, his heavy Colt revolver drawn and cocked with deadly intent. "That woman's the lawfully contracted property of Edmund Fitzroy, sealed and witnessed according to territorial law. You're stealing a white man's bride, and that's a hanging offense in any civilized jurisdiction." Destined lifted Helene onto the Appaloosa's back, with gentle strength despite the urgency of their situation, his hands supporting her as she struggled to maintain her balance. The horse remained perfectly still during the mounting process, trained to stand steady even under the most chaotic circumstances. As he swung up behind her on the horse's bare back, his arm encircling her waist to hold her secure. Destined's voice carried across the alley with quiet dignity. "Some things cannot be owned, the wind, not the rain, not the human spirit. A man who believes otherwise understands nothing of what makes life sacred." His heels dug sharply into the horse's flanks, and the animal exploded into motion with the power of controlled lightning, its hooves throwing up clouds of dust as they raced toward the open desert beyond the town's ramshackle boundaries. The Appaloosa moved with the fluid grace of its wild ancestors, each stride eating up ground with remarkable efficiency. Thorn's hastily aimed shot splintered the wooden fence post beside them, sending sharp fragments flying through the air like deadly splinters. His roar of rage that followed echoed through the gathering dusk, drawing curious faces to windows and doorways throughout the settlement. "Get after them, every man who can ride $50 for the woman brought back unharmed. Another 50 for that Apache's worthless hide hanging from a tree." The promise of gold worked its predictable magic on the desperate men who populated frontier towns. Within minutes, a dozen riders were saddled and ready to pursue their greed, overcoming any reservations they might have had about hunting down a woman and her rescuer. Thorne's authority, combined with the lure of easy money, created an instant posse united in purpose, if not in moral character. But Destined knew these lands with an intimacy that no white settler could match, having spent his entire life learning every canyon, every hidden spring, every game trail that wound through the seemingly barren wilderness. As the last crimson light faded from the western sky, and the first stars began to appear in the vast dome of desert sky, he guided his horse along paths that existed more in memory than physical reality routes used by his people for generations to move unseen through their ancestral territory. The Appaloosa's hooves made barely a whisper against the sandstone as they climbed higher into the wilderness, following ancient tracks that seemed to disappear entirely in some places, only to reappear around the next bend or after crossing a stretch of bare rock that revealed no sign of their passage. The pursuing posse fell farther behind, with each passing mile, their horses struggling on unfamiliar ground, while Destined and Helene moved like ghosts through the gathering darkness. 20 miles from Willow Springs, where Red Mesa rose like a sleeping giant against the star-scattered sky, its ancient layers of sedimentary rock creating natural terraces and hidden caves that had sheltered Apache families for countless generations, Destined finally allowed his horse to slow to a walk. The mesa's imposing bulk offered protection from the desert winds, while its height provided commanding views of the surrounding territory, making it an ideal location for a temporary camp. A small fire flickered in a sheltered hollow between massive boulders that had tumbled from the mesa's heights eons ago, the flames carefully positioned so that the light would not be visible from the plains below. The fire was tended by a young Apache man who looked up sharply at their approach, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt before recognition dawned in his intelligent dark eyes. Cousin Tokala said in their native tongue, relief evident in his voice, as he rose to greet them with the fluid grace of a natural athlete. I heard shots from the white man's town echoing across the desert. When you did not return at sunset as planned, I began to fear that you had been taken or killed. Tokala was 17 years old, with the lean build and quick reflexes of a natural warrior, combined with the eager intelligence of youth, still learning the harsh lessons of adult responsibility. His face bore the fine bone structure characteristic of his people, while his dark eyes held depths of understanding that seemed older than his years. He wore a mixture of traditional Apache clothing and items taken from white settlements, a calico shirt over deerskin leggings with a red bandana tied around his forehead to keep his long black hair from his eyes, and a cavalry saber hanging at his side, a trophy from some forgotten skirmish. Despite his youth, Tokala carried himself with the confidence of someone who had already proven his courage in battle and earned his place among the warriors of his band. The respect in his voice when he addressed his older cousin spoke of genuine affection, tempered by the formal courtesy that Apache culture demanded between family members of different generations. This woman was being forced into slavery disguised as marriage by corrupt lawmen who served their own greed rather than justice. Destined replied, dismounting with fluid grace and helping Helene down from the horse with gentle care. But the corruption runs deeper than we first suspected, cousin. They hold innocent families hostage to ensure cooperation from those who would otherwise oppose their crimes. Helene stood unsteadily beside the crackling mesquite fire, her legs shaking from the wild ride and the accumulated shock of her ordeal. The warmth felt good against her skin after the chill of the desert night, but she found herself unable to stop trembling as the full weight of her situation began to sink in. She was alone in hostile territory, unable to speak above a whisper, with no protection save that offered by two Apache warriors who had every reason to distrust white people based on generations of betrayal and broken promises. Yet something in their manner toward her, a respect for her dignity, that had been completely absent in her treatment by the supposed forces of law and order, made her feel safer than she had since Robert's murder. These men might be considered her enemies, according to everything she had been taught about racial differences and social boundaries, but they had shown her more genuine courtesy in 5 minutes than Thorne had managed in his entire career as a peace officer. When Tokala offered her a gourd filled with cool water drawn from a hidden spring, she managed to whisper, Thank you." The words came out barely audible, but they carried genuine gratitude for kindness shown without expectation of reward. Your voice returned slowly. Dasan observed, settling cross-legged on a flat stone worn smooth by countless years of use as a seat. That is good. We will have great need of words in the days ahead, for this fight will be won with truth as much as with weapons. Tokala's eyes brightened with the eager curiosity of youth, presented with the prospect of meaningful action. You speak of war, cousin. Have the white authorities finally pushed too far in their arrogance and greed? I speak of justice. Dasan replied, his tone carrying the weight of ancient wisdom passed down through generations of Apache leaders who had learned to choose their battles carefully. Sometimes justice and war walk the same path, but a wise warrior knows the difference between fighting for right and fighting for revenge. When Helene tried to explain her situation in greater detail, her damaged voice failing after a few whispered words that barely carried across the small circle of firelight, she looked around the camp and spotted a piece of charcoal that had fallen from the fire. The black fragment was perfect for writing a gift from the flames that would allow her to communicate despite her physical limitations. Kneeling beside a smooth sandstone slab that nature had provided as if specifically for this purpose, she began to write in careful letters, her educated handwriting clear and precise, despite the primitive writing materials. Helene Müller, my fiancé, Robert Keller, was murdered 3 days ago. Both Apache men watched with growing interest and respect as she continued writing their appreciation for her intelligence evident in their expressions. Despite the trauma she had endured, she was thinking clearly enough to communicate effectively and provide crucial information, showing the kind of mental toughness that both warriors valued highly in allies and enemies alike. She sketched a rough but accurate map of Owl Canyon, based on the many times she had accompanied Robert to his modest gold claim, marking several locations with careful precision. The canyon's distinctive features, the sacred spring, the narrow entrance, the hidden caves where Apache families had once taken shelter during cavalry raids, all appeared in their proper relationships to each other. Below the map, she wrote in increasingly urgent letters, "Evidence hidden here." Robert kept records of everything he saw. And then, after a moment's hesitation, as she remembered fragments of overheard conversations and disturbing observations, "Other girls taken too, sold like cattle." The two Apache men exchanged meaningful glances as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear, their worst fears about white corruption confirmed by her written testimony. This was not simply a matter of claim-jumping or cattle-rustling crimes that were unfortunately common in the lawless territories, but something far more sinister that violated the most basic principles of human decency. The sheriff's men have claimed Owl Canyon as their own territory for weeks now. Tokala said, switching to English for Helene's benefit, while his young voice carried the controlled anger of someone who had witnessed injustice but been powerless to stop it. They told our people that any Apache found near the sacred spring would be shot as horse thieves and cattle rustlers, driving us away from waters our ancestors have used since the world was young. Horse thieves. Dasan repeated his voice, carrying the dry irony of someone who had learned to find bitter humor in white man's accusations. An interesting charge from men who steal human lives and call it business. But their lies reveal their fear. They know their crimes cannot withstand the light of truth. Helene wrote again, her letters becoming more urgent as she tried to convey the full horror of what she had witnessed. They said Robert went crazy from gold fever, claimed he attacked me, all lies to cover murder. Truth has a way of surfacing like water finding its path through solid stone. Dasan said quietly, studying her face in the flickering firelight and seeing the fierce determination that blazed behind her fear and grief. The question is whether we have the courage to dig deep enough to reach it. Will you help us retrieve this evidence? Tokala asked his young voice, eager for action, but tempered by respect for his cousin's greater experience and wisdom. Dasan was silent for a long moment, weighing the risks against the potential for justice in the careful manner of a leader who understood that his decisions affected not just himself, but his entire people. The fire crackled softly in the desert silence, sending sparks spiraling up toward the infinite canopy of stars that had witnessed countless such councils of war throughout Apache history. Finally, he spoke with the measured cadence of someone making a sacred vow. The white man's law has shown little interest in protecting my people or serving true justice. But perhaps it is time to remind them that righteousness flows in both directions and that those who pervert justice in service of greed will eventually face the consequences of their choices. Before they could discuss their plans in greater detail, the sound of approaching hoofbeats brought all three to instant alertness hands, moving to weapons as they prepared to defend their sanctuary. But instead of Thorn's vengeful posse, a single rider emerged from the darkness, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies and moving with the careful deliberation of someone who meant no harm. Henry Lowe was a weathered homesteader in his 40s, whose sun-beaten face bore the deep lines and permanent squint of a man who had spent his entire adult life wrestling survival from an unforgiving land that grudged every blade of grass and drop of water. His clothes were patched and repatched with the careful economy of someone who understood that waste meant death in the desert, while his worn boots showed the miles he had walked behind plow and harrow in his endless battle against drought and alkali soil. But his weathered exterior concealed a core of moral steel that had been tempered by years of hardship and loss, and his eyes held the steady determination of someone who had never learned to quit when the cause was right and innocent people needed protection. "Evening, folks," Henry said, dismounting from his tired mule with the careful movements of a man whose bones ached from years of hard labor. "Name's Henry Lowe. I've got a small spread about 10 miles south of here, nothing fancy but honest work that puts food on the table." Dasan kept his rifle ready, but his voice remained neutral years of experience, having taught him to be cautious of white men bearing gifts or claiming friendship. "You ride far from home in dangerous times, Henry Lowe. What brings you to seek Apache fires in the darkness? Dangerous times got a way of making men choose sides." Henry replied, his weathered hands resting easy on his saddle horn in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. "My boy Tommy was in town when word came about what Sheriff Thorn tried to do to this young lady. Some things ain't right, no matter who's doing them or what excuse they give for their actions." He looked directly at Helene with genuine compassion, softening his weathered features, the expression of a man who had daughters of his own and understood a father's protective instincts. "Miss, I don't know you from Adam's off-ox, but no woman deserves what that badge-wearing snake put you through. Man's got daughters and granddaughters of his own. He ought to know better than to treat any female like property to be bought and sold." Helene managed to whisper, her voice slightly stronger after the rest and water. "Your son, is he safe?" Thorn threatened Deputy Webb's grandchildren to ensure his cooperation. "Safe as houses." Henry assured her with the quiet confidence of a man who had taken proper precautions. "Got Tommy and his older brother watching the homestead with loaded rifles and instructions to trust nobody wearing a badge until this whole business gets sorted out proper. But I came here because I got information you folks might find useful in the fight ahead." He glanced around the circle of firelight, noting the weapons within easy reach and the alert postures of the two Apache warriors before continuing with the careful precision of someone delivering a military intelligence report. "Crowthers brought in some special help from down Mexico, way professional killers, with reputations that'd curdle fresh milk. Word is they're being paid triple rates to make sure this whole business gets settled permanent-like, with no loose ends left to cause future embarrassment." "These specialists have names?" Dasan asked his warrior's instinct, recognizing the importance of knowing one's enemies and their capabilities. Greasy Pete Hatchet Harry and quiet Will. Henry replied grimly, each name carrying its own weight of implied menace. Pete's a pig who kills for the sheer pleasure of it. They say he's got a necklace made from the ears of men he's murdered. Harry's an artist with blades, can put a throwing knife in your eye from 50 yards away, and considers it poor marksmanship if he needs a second throw. And Will? Well, they call him quiet because you never hear him coming, and by the time you see him, it's already too late to matter. Tokala's young features showed no fear at the prospect of facing such dangerous opponents. Only the eager anticipation of a warrior finally granted the chance to test his skills against worthy enemies. How many men does this Crowther command in total? We need to understand the full scope of the forces arrayed against us. Hard to say for certain. Henry admitted with the honesty of a man who understood that overconfidence killed more surely than enemy bullets. He's got his regular ranch hands, maybe 8 or 10 men who signed on to work cattle, but ain't too particular about the exact nature of their duties. Then there's the sheriff's men who've thrown in with the corruption, another half-dozen deputies, and hangers-on who'll do whatever Thorne tells them for a share of the profits. Add in the specialists and whatever drifters he can hire with promises of easy money, and you're looking at maybe 25 guns all told. 25 against 3. Tokala mused with the casual confidence of youth that had not yet learned to fear overwhelming odds. My grandfather faced worse at Canyon de Chelly when the soldiers came to drive our people into exile. He said the spirits fight alongside warriors who battle for justice. This ain't about glory or proving courage, boy. Henry said seriously, his weathered face grave in the firelight. These men ain't soldiers following some code of honor or rules of engagement. They're killers who'd shoot you in the back without losing a minute's sleep over it, then step over your body to get at whatever money might be in your pockets. Then we must be smarter than they are brave. Dasan observed with the tactical thinking of a war leader who had survived countless battles through careful planning rather than reckless heroism. Tell me, Henry Lowe, what personal stake do you have in this fight? Why risk your life and your family's safety for strangers? Henry was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, as if seeing ghosts dancing in the flames. Memories that brought pain, even after years of trying to forget. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief that had never fully healed. 3 years ago, my niece Sarah came out from back east to visit us, just a girl really barely 18 years old, and full of dreams about the frontier and all the adventures she was going to have in the wide open spaces. His weathered hands clenched into fists as he remembered. Pretty little thing with yellow hair and blue eyes, always laughing and asking questions about everything she saw. She was planning to stay the whole summer, maybe even convince her parents to let her come live with us permanent-like. One day she rode into Willow Springs to buy supplies for a birthday cake she wanted to make for my wife, and never came back home. The pain in his voice was raw, despite the passage of years. Thorne organized search parties, made all the right noises about investigating her disappearance. Claimed she must have met with some accident on the trail, maybe thrown from her horse or taken by Apaches, or any number of explanations that sounded reasonable if you didn't think about them too hard. Helene felt her throat tighten with more than just physical damage. As she realized the scope of the horror they were uncovering, the systematic nature of crimes that had been disguised as random tragedies or acceptable losses in a dangerous territory. She managed to whisper, "How many others? How many families have suffered the same loss? More than I care to count, and that's just the ones I know about personally." Henry replied heavily. Young women passing through on their way to new lives, recent widows whose property got sold at suspiciously low prices after they disappeared. Wives whose husbands met with convenient accidents that left them vulnerable and alone. Always a plausible explanation, always some reason why nobody should ask too many uncomfortable questions. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth, handling it with the reverence due to sacred relics. My wife, Sarah, not my niece. My wife's got the same name. She used to work as a seamstress before we married, made clothes for ladies throughout the territory. After our Sarah disappeared, she started paying attention to things she'd never noticed before. What kind of things? Dasan asked, sensing that crucial information was about to be revealed. Dress patterns and fabrics. Henry explained, unwrapping the bundle to reveal scraps of cloth in various colors and designs. My Sarah's got an eye for such details, remembers every dress she ever made and who she made it for. These samples here, they're from dresses that belong to women who supposedly left the territory of their own free will. But the cloth turned up later in places where no decent woman would ever go voluntarily. 20 miles away in Willow Springs, a very different conversation was taking place in the back room of the Silver Dollar Saloon, where the real power in the territory conducted its business away from prying eyes and moral sensibilities. The room reeked of cigar smoke and spilled whiskey, while a poker table bore the stains of countless games where men's fortunes, and sometimes their lives, had been decided with the turn of a card. Sheriff Claude Thorne paced the floor like a caged mountain lion, his boots echoing hollowly on the rough wooden planks as his frustration mounted with each passing minute. The loss of his primary witness and the exposure of his methods to federal scrutiny represented threats that could unravel years of careful corruption and profitable crime. Meanwhile, Lucian Crowther sat at the poker table with deceptive calm, shuffling a deck of cards with the mechanical precision of a man whose mind was focused on far more serious games than simple gambling. His movements were economical and controlled each gesture calculated to project an image of unshakable composure, even as he planned responses to multiple crisis scenarios. Crowther was a man of 45, with silver-streaked hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to calculate the worth and vulnerability of everything they looked upon. His clothes were expensive, but practical tailored wool trousers that had cost more than most men earned in a month, a silk vest imported from San Francisco, and boots made from the finest leather that money could buy in the civilized world. Unlike Thorne's crude displays of power through violence and intimidation, Crowther's authority came from intelligence, careful planning, and an absolute ruthlessness that made him far more dangerous than any common outlaw who relied solely on physical force to achieve his objectives. That Apache took the one asset who could directly implicate us in the Keller elimination. Thorne set his voice tight with frustration as he struggled to control his legendary temper. If she reaches territorial authorities with her version of events, if she can convince them to investigate her wild claims about murder and corruption, she won't. Crowther interrupted smoothly, never looking up from his cards as he spoke with the quiet confidence of a chess master who could see dozens of moves ahead. His voice carried no more emotion than if he were discussing cattle prices or weather patterns rather than human lives and federal crimes. A traumatized woman with severe vocal damage makes for notably unreliable testimony, particularly when her story directly contradicts sworn statements from multiple peace officers with established reputations for honesty and competence. Any territorial judge would take our word over the ravings of a grief-stricken female whose mind has obviously been affected by recent tragic events. He set down the cards with precise movements and fixed Thorne with a stare that made the sheriff uncomfortably aware of who really controlled their partnership and made the crucial decisions that affected both their futures. However, Claude, you've overlooked the more significant concern in this situation. The woman mentioned hidden evidence documentation that Robert Keller allegedly maintained regarding our various business operations. That represents a threat of an entirely different magnitude than mere witness testimony. Thorne's weathered face went pale as he contemplated the implications of written records falling into hostile hands. You think that little prospector actually kept detailed records of what he observed? Most miners can barely write their own names, let alone maintain systematic documentation. I think Robert Keller possessed the methodical mind of a trained engineer. Crowther replied, rising from his chair and walking to the window where he could observe the mostly empty street while his analytical mind worked through various possibilities and contingencies. Such individuals have a compulsive need to document their observations with scientific precision, treating evidence gathering as a form of intellectual discipline. If he discovered the true scope of our activities, he would have recorded every detail as insurance against our potential retaliation. The rancher's calculating gaze swept the darkened street as he continued his analysis with the cold precision of a military strategist evaluating battlefield conditions. The critical question becomes, did he share the location of this documentation with his intended bride, and if so, does she possess sufficient intelligence and determination to understand its value and attempt to use it against us? So what's your solution to this problem? Thorne demanded, his patience strained by Crowther's analytical approach, when immediate action seemed required. We can't exactly post advertisements in the territorial newspapers asking for volunteers to search every cave and hiding place between here and Mexico. Fortunately, I've already arranged for the necessary expertise. Crowther said, his smile containing no warmth whatsoever, merely the cold satisfaction of a predator who had anticipated this exact scenario and prepared accordingly. 3 specialists arrived in town this afternoon via the southern route. They understand the parameters of our situation and have been compensated generously for their discretion and efficiency. As if summoned by his words, the saloon's back door opened with deliberate quiet to admit 3 men whose very presence seemed to lower the temperature of the room and make shadows deeper in the corners where lamplight failed to penetrate. They moved with the casual confidence of professionals who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with sufficient application of violence, and who viewed killing as simply another form of skilled labor. Our gentlemen, Crowther said without preamble, addressing them with the tone he might use for discussing a routine business transaction. We have a resource recovery situation that requires your particular talents and expertise. An Apache warrior has acquired possession of a white woman who possesses information that could prove detrimental to certain legitimate business interests operating in this territory. Greasy Pete, the largest of the 3, at well over 6 feet in height and built like a bull, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the floor, with casual disregard for the establishment's furnishings or the sensibilities of its other patrons. His massive frame was clothed in garments that reeked of substances better left unidentified, while his gun belt sagged under the weight of 2 heavy Colt revolvers and enough ammunition to fight a small war. Apache, you say? Pete's voice carried the lazy menace of a man who took genuine pleasure in the suffering of others. Been a considerable spell since I collected any red scalps for my collection. What's the compensation structure for this particular engagement? And are there any restrictions on methods of operation? $1,000 for successful completion of the primary objective. Crowther replied with the matter-of-fact tone of a banker discussing loan terms, causing all 3 killers to straighten with obvious interest at the astronomical sum involved. The woman must be recovered intact and conscious for detailed interrogation regarding the location of certain documents. The Apache's ultimate condition is entirely irrelevant to our strategic objectives. Hatchet Harry, lean and scarred with the precise movements of a trained athlete, spoke with the careful diction of an educated man who had consciously chosen violence as his preferred profession rather than being driven to it by circumstances or desperation. Might I inquire about the specific nature of this documentation? Understanding the full scope of what we're seeking helps determine the most efficient methodology for achieving our objectives. Records relating to certain commodity transfers and personnel arrangements that occurred without full compliance with territorial oversight procedures. Crowther said carefully, his lawyer's training evident in his ability to describe federal crimes in terms that sounded like minor bureaucratic irregularities. Nothing that need concern you beyond the absolute requirement that such materials be recovered intact or destroyed completely to prevent future complications. Quiet Will, whose deliberately forgettable appearance masked a reputation for lethality that extended throughout the southwestern territories, finally spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, but carrying unmistakable authority within their professional relationship. Timeline parameters, immediate implementation. Crowther replied with increased urgency. Every hour of delay exponentially increases the probability of external complications that could jeopardize the entire operation. The territorial authorities have been asking increasingly inconvenient questions about recent personnel changes and disappearances in this area, and we cannot afford to have them discover concrete evidence of our various enterprises. As the three killers departed to begin their hunt, moving with the silent efficiency of apex predators who had spent their entire adult lives stalking human prey, Deputy Marcus Webb sat on the steps outside the sheriff's office. He cradled his broken wrist against his chest while wrestling with a moral crisis that would define not only the remainder of his life, but potentially the lives of everyone he held dear. The pain in his shattered arm was nothing compared to the agony in his conscience as he contemplated the innocent blood on his hands and the additional crimes he would be expected to facilitate if Crowther's organization continued to operate with impunity. For 3 years he had been trapped in a web of blackmail and coercion that made him an unwilling accessory to violations of every principle he held sacred, forced to watch as justice was perverted in service of greed and cruelty. The threat to his family was absolutely real. Crowther's men had made that abundantly clear during their midnight visit to his daughter's homestead 2 months ago, when they had demonstrated their knowledge of his grandchildren's daily routines and favorite hiding places while delivering their ultimatum with cold precision. Every day that passed without seeing little Emma and Samuel alive was another twist of the psychological knife that Crowther used to ensure his continued cooperation. But tonight, listening to the casual discussion of murder and systematic brutality, Webb finally reached the breaking point where conscience overcame fear and moral duty superseded personal safety. Rising stiffly from the steps, his broken wrist throbbing with every movement, but his resolve strengthened by righteous anger, Webb made his way through the darkened streets to the telegraph office, with a desperate plan forming in his mind. If he could get word to honest federal authorities before Crowther's killers could complete their mission, there might still be hope for justice and protection for all the innocent people caught in this web of corruption. The night operator, an elderly man named Peterson, who had been sending messages across the vast distances of the territory for 20 years, looked up in surprise as the deputy entered his small office. The old telegrapher had seen enough of human nature during his career to recognize desperation when it walked through his door, and something in Webb's expression immediately put him on alert. "Kinda late for official business, ain't it, Marcus? Most folks are home in bed by this hour, and the sheriff don't usually send messages after dark unless there's some kind of emergency situation." Webb's voice was steady despite the fear that gnawed at his insides like acid, the product of a decision that had crystallized his resolve beyond any possibility of retreat. "Got an urgent message for the territorial marshal in Tucson, Mr. Peterson. Priority transmission that needs to go out tonight, and it can't wait for morning or regular business hours." As Peterson prepared his equipment with the practiced efficiency of long experience, Webb composed the most important communication of his life, choosing each word with the meticulous care of someone who understood that failure meant death, not just for himself, but for every innocent person whose protection depended on his courage. The telegraph key began its staccato rhythm, sending his desperate plea for help racing across hundreds of miles of copper wire toward the territorial capital where honest men still existed who would respond to evidence of systematic corruption and federal crimes. But even as the message flew through the night on wings of electricity, carrying hope for justice across the vast distances of the American West, Crowther's professional killers were already moving into position for their carefully planned assault on the Apache camp where their targets had taken refuge. They had tracked their quarry with the methodical efficiency of men who had spent their entire adult lives hunting other human beings, following sign that would have been completely invisible to ordinary eyes, but stood out like highway markers to trackers of their caliber. Greasy Pete had found the spot where the Appaloosa had paused to drink from a hidden spring, while Hatchet Harry had identified the specific rocks that showed scuff marks from moccasin soles during the climb to higher ground. Quiet Will had discovered broken twigs and displaced stones that marked their passage with the precision of a surveyor's map, each tiny disturbance telling part of the story of their flight from Willow Springs. The attack came just before dawn in that gray hour when human alertness reaches its lowest ebb, and visibility provides just enough light for accurate shooting without exposing the attackers to effective return fire. It was a time favored by professional killers throughout history, when defenders would be least prepared and most vulnerable to surprise assault. Greasy Pete positioned himself on the ridge above the camp, with a rifle that could reach out and touch targets at distances that made conventional defenses utterly useless. The weapon was a custom-built instrument of death, its telescopic sight carefully calibrated for precision work at extended range, while its heavy barrel and specialized ammunition guaranteed that any hit would be immediately fatal. The first shot came without warning, striking sparks from the rocks, inches from where Destined sat, checking his weapons in the pre-dawn gloom. The Apache warrior's reflexes, honed by years of combat against enemies who showed no mercy to the defeated, took over instantly as he rolled away from the fire and came up with his Winchester ready for action. But the muzzle flash from Pete's position was already gone, leaving Destined with no clear target and the knowledge that he was facing opponents who understood the tactical advantages of superior positioning and overwhelming firepower. Tokala. Destined called in Apache, his voice carrying the urgent authority of a war leader directing his forces under fire. Take the woman to the cave, move quickly, but stay low. But even as the young warrior moved to obey his cousin's command, Hatchet Harry's throwing knives came spinning out of the darkness with the deadly precision that had made his reputation throughout the criminal underworld. One blade buried itself in the ground, where Tokala had been standing a split second before, while another sparked off the stone wall above Helene's head as she dove for cover behind the supply packs with reflexes sharpened by recent trauma. Henry Lowe proved his worth in the opening minutes of the chaotic battle, his old army rifle speaking with the methodical precision of a man who had learned during 4 years of civil war to make every shot count when ammunition was scarce. And accuracy meant the difference between victory and death. Over there. He called out his weathered voice, cutting through the pandemonium with the authority of a veteran sergeant directing troops under fire. Behind that big boulder, shaped like a buffalo, I can see his powder smoke hanging in the air. His first bullet took Hatchet Harry in the shoulder, the heavy slug spinning the knife thrower around and disrupting his deadly accuracy, just enough to give the defenders precious breathing room in which to organize their resistance. But the professional killer was far from finished adapting to his wound with the resilience of someone who had survived countless similar encounters by refusing to acknowledge pain or defeat. Harry switched smoothly to his left hand and continued to send steel death flying toward their positions, his ambidextrous skill allowing him to maintain a devastating rate of accurate fire despite his injury. Each thrown blade was a masterwork of applied physics, calculated for trajectory, wind resistance, and target movement, with the precision of an artillery officer plotting coordinates. It was during this desperate exchange of fire that Quiet Will demonstrated why he had earned his fearsome reputation throughout the territories, working his way silently through the maze of boulders and brush, with a skill that bordered on supernatural. His movement technique was so flawless that he seemed to become one with the shadows themselves, each step calculated to avoid the smallest sound that might alert his intended victims to their approaching doom. His approach was methodically perfect, taking advantage of every fold in the terrain and every shadow cast by the irregular rock formations until he had worked his way to within striking distance of Helene's position. A few more silent steps would bring him close enough to complete his mission with knife work that would leave no doubt about the fate that awaited anyone who interfered with Crowther's operations. But salvation came from the most unexpected source imaginable. Deputy Marcus Webb appeared at the camp's perimeter, like a specter materializing from the pre-dawn darkness, his broken wrist supported by a makeshift sling fashioned from his neckerchief, and his good hand gripping a double-barreled shotgun with desperate determination. His arrival at that precise moment was either divine providence or extraordinary luck coinciding perfectly with Quiet Will's final approach to create the intervention that would save Helene's life and alter the course of the entire battle. Webb's warning shout alerted the defenders just as the professional killer prepared to strike, turning certain death into desperate opportunity. Behind you. He's behind the big rock with the crack down the middle. Webb's shotgun boomed twice in rapid succession, and the heavy loads of buckshot chewing substantial chunks from the stone where Quiet Will had taken cover and filling the air with deadly lead pellets and rock fragments. The killer returned fire with both pistols, his accurate shooting forcing the deputy to dive for shelter behind a fallen log. But the crucial damage was already done. His position was exposed and his tactical advantage lost. Why? Destined called out during a brief lull in the shooting, genuinely puzzled by the deputy's unexpected assistance, and wondering if this might be some elaborate trap designed to lower their defenses. Webb's answer came back strained with emotion and physical pain, but carrying the unmistakable ring of absolute truth. Because they've got my grandchildren. Because I'm tired of being scared of my own shadow and helping evil men commit crimes that make me sick to look at myself in the mirror. His voice cracked with the weight of suppressed guilt and months of moral compromise, because I've helped them cover up things that'll haunt me until my dying day. And maybe this is my one chance to balance the scales and do something right for once in my miserable life. The revelation explained much about Webb's previous behavior and nervous demeanor, transforming him from a willing accomplice into another victim of Crowther's systematic program of coercion and intimidation. But there was no time to explore the implications further, as Greasy Pete had shifted position on the ridge and was laying down suppressing fire that kept all the defenders pinned behind inadequate cover, while his remaining partner maneuvered for killing shots. It was young Tokala who provided the tactical solution they desperately needed, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain and his natural climbing abilities to work his way up a narrow chimney in the rock face that most adults would have considered impassable. The route brought him to within knife-throwing distance of Pete's carefully chosen sniper position, while avoiding the fields of fire that covered all the obvious approaches. The young Apache moved with the fluid grace inherited from generations of ancestors who had survived in this harsh landscape through superior adaptation and intimate knowledge of their environment. Every handhold and footstep was calculated to maintain perfect silence, while the stone itself seemed to aid his ascent, providing purchase where none should have existed. For my grandfather, who died at Canyon de Chelly, Tokala whispered as he prepared to make his throw, invoking the memory of family members who had suffered under previous waves of white expansion and military action. For the sacred springs, they have poisoned with their greed and corruption. His blade found its mark with the deadly precision that his people had perfected over centuries of warfare against larger and better equipped enemies, the steel point sliding between Pete's ribs to find his heart with surgical accuracy. The massive killer's rifle clattered down the rocky slope as he pitched forward, his reign of terror ended by a 17-year-old who fought not for personal glory, but for justice and the protection of innocence. But victory in warfare, they always comes at a price. And this battle was no exception to that harsh rule. As Tokala worked his way back down the treacherous cliff face, moving more slowly now, due to fatigue and the natural caution that comes after the adrenaline of combat begins to fade, Quiet Will's accurate pistol work caught him in the thigh with a bullet that sent him tumbling the last 15 feet to land hard among the boulders at the base of the cliff. Tokala. Helene's voice had returned enough strength for her to cry out in genuine anguish as she witnessed the young warrior's fall, her concern for others overriding every instinct for self-preservation that might have kept her safely hidden behind cover. Without conscious thought or consideration of the danger, she left her concealed position, and ran toward where the young Apache lay bleeding, her basic human compassion proving stronger than rational fear. Her movement across the open ground made her a perfect target for any enemy with a clear line of sight. But she was beyond caring about personal safety when someone who had risked his life for her was wounded and needed immediate help. Quiet Will's second shot missed her head by mere inches, the bullet's passage so close that she could feel the displacement of air against her cheek. But the near miss was enough to send her diving for cover behind the same boulder where Tokala had taken refuge, her heart pounding with the realization of how close she had come to death. The killer's pale eyes tracked her movement with predatory intensity as he calculated angles and distances for a shot that would eliminate both wounded targets with a single well-placed bullet, his professional mind already working through the geometry of murder with mechanical precision. But he never got the chance to implement his lethal calculations. Dassan's Winchester spoke from an unexpected angle, the heavy slug catching Quiet Will's center mass and driving him backward into a tangle of prickly pear cactus, where he lay motionless, his weapons scattered uselessly in the dust around his lifeless form. The sudden silence that followed the cessation of gunfire was almost more unnerving than the battle itself had been. Smoke drifted lazily across the camp from the various weapons that had been discharged, while the acrid smell of burned powder mixed with the metallic scent of spilled blood to create an atmosphere of aftermath that none of the survivors would ever completely forget. But the respite was destined to be brief. Hatchet Harry, wounded but still extremely dangerous, and driven by professional pride as much as Crowther's Gold had used the confusion of the final exchange to work his way closer to the camp's center through a series of carefully planned movements that took advantage of every distraction and moment of inattention. Now he rose from concealment like a specter of death, a throwing knife gleaming in each scarred hand, and murder blazing in his eyes as he prepared to complete his mission regardless of personal cost. His educated voice made harsh by pain and frustration, but still carrying traces of refinement that hinted at a very different past, cut through the morning air with deadly promise. Enough of these games and amateur theatrics. He snarled, blood seeping through his shirt from the shoulder wound that had failed to disable his deadly skills. The woman dies now, and then we'll discover just how brave these Apache warriors really are when it comes to watching their friends bleed out slowly while begging for mercy they'll never receive. His arm drew back in preparation for a throw that would end Helene's life instantly, the blade positioned with the precision of long practice, and calculated to penetrate her heart before she could even register the motion. Years of training and natural talent combined to make him a living weapon that few opponents could hope to survive, even when warned of his intentions. But before he could release his deadly projectiles, a new voice cut through the morning air with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command and trained to take immediate control of chaotic situations. "Drop your weapons immediately. This is the United States Marshal Service, and you are surrounded." Deputy Webb's desperate telegraph message had reached its intended destination, after all carried across the vast distances of the territory by copper wires that connected isolated outposts to the centers of federal authority. Marshal Daniel Harrison, a grizzled veteran of frontier law enforcement, whose reputation for integrity was matched only by his skill with weapons and tactics, stood at the camp's entrance, with a dozen armed deputies spread out behind him in a textbook skirmish line that effectively sealed off any possibility of escape. The sight of federal badges gleaming in the morning sun and rifles pointed with professional precision was enough to break what remained of Hatchet Harry's resolve to complete his mission. His knives clattered to the ground as he raised his hands in surrender, the fight draining out of him as completely as water from a broken bucket when faced with odds that even his considerable skills could not overcome. "Our Marshal Harrison," Webb said with obvious relief, struggling to his feet despite his injuries and the exhaustion that came from making the most important moral decision of his life. "Thank God Almighty you got my message in time to prevent a massacre." Harrison's weathered face showed no emotion as he surveyed the scene of battle with the professional assessment of someone who had investigated countless similar situations during his long career in territorial law enforcement. He took careful note of the bodies of dead killers, the obvious signs of a desperate fight for survival, and the defensive positions that told their own story about who had been the aggressors in this encounter. Got here fast as we could manage, Deputy Webb. The marshal replied with the crisp efficiency of a military officer delivering a situation report. Your telegraph message about federal crimes and systematic territorial corruption lit a considerable fire under some very important people in the territorial capital. When judges and senators start demanding immediate action, things tend to happen with remarkable speed. As the immediate danger passed and the adrenaline of combat began to fade from their systems, Helene found her voice returning with startling clarity and strength. As if the trauma that had stolen her ability to speak was finally beginning to heal through the catharsis of surviving mortal peril. B. Marshal Harrison. She said, her words carrying new authority and confidence with each syllable. There's documentary evidence hidden at Owl Canyon that provides absolute proof that Sheriff Thorne and Lucian Crowther are operating a criminal organization that includes murder, systematic theft, and human trafficking on a scale that extends throughout this territory and possibly beyond. Harrison's eyebrows rose at the serious nature of the charges being presented, but his expression remained professionally neutral as he prepared to evaluate evidence rather than accept accusations at face value. Those are extremely serious allegations, miss. Federal crimes of that magnitude could result in executions if proven in court. Do you have concrete proof to support claims of such scope and severity? My fiancé Robert Keller was murdered 3 days ago when he discovered the true nature of their operations at Owl Canyon. Helene continued, her voice growing steadier and more confident as she spoke, drawing strength from the knowledge that she was finally able to bear witness to the truth that had cost Robert his life. He was a careful man trained as an engineer, and he kept detailed records of everything he observed during his time working his claim near their center of operations. Those records are hidden at the canyon, and if you can recover them before Crowther's remaining men destroy the evidence, you'll have all the documentation you need to shut down their entire criminal network and bring justice to their victims. Marshal Harrison listened to her account with the focused attention of a professional lawman who had heard enough lies during his career to recognize truth when he encountered it in its pure form. The clarity of her testimony, the specific nature of her claims, and the obvious intelligence behind her observations all combined to create a compelling case that demanded immediate investigation. When she finished speaking, he turned to his deputies with the crisp efficiency of a commander implementing a carefully planned operation. Johnson, take 4 men and secure the town of Willow Springs immediately. Arrest Sheriff Thorne on charges of murder conspiracy and violation of federal statutes relating to interstate commerce and territorial administration. Patterson, you and the rest of the boys, come with me to this Owl Canyon location. We're going to find this evidence Miss Miller has described and put a permanent end to this corruption before it can spread any further. But even as the federal officers prepared to move against the criminal organization with the full weight of territorial authority behind them, Lucian Crowther was implementing his own final solution to the crisis that threatened to destroy his carefully constructed empire and expose him to federal prosecution that would certainly result in his execution. Word of the failed attack on the Apache camp had reached him through the network of informants and messengers that he maintained throughout the territory, a system of communication that had served him well in his various illegal enterprises, but now brought news of disaster and approaching retribution. If Thorne was captured and forced to testify in exchange for leniency, and if the evidence at Owl Canyon fell into federal hands, as seemed increasingly likely, the resulting investigation would inevitably lead back to him and expose the full extent of his criminal activities. The only way to avoid that outcome was to eliminate all witnesses and destroy all evidence, regardless of the collateral damage such drastic action might require, or the innocent lives it might cost. Crowther had spent years building an extensive network of relationships throughout the southwestern territories, corrupt officials who could be bought, intimidated settlers who could be coerced, and professional criminals who could be hired for any task that money could motivate. Now he prepared to call in every favor and activate every resource at his disposal for one final, desperate gamble that would either secure his position permanently or destroy him completely in the attempt. The dozen heavily armed men he assembled in the pre-dawn darkness were not the careful professionals he usually employed for delicate operations requiring subtlety and deniability. These were desperate criminals recruited from the worst elements of frontier society, claimed jumpers who had murdered for worthless patches of desert cattle, rustlers who had graduated to highway robbery, army deserters who had abandoned their posts rather than face court-martial, and killers who asked no questions about their targets as long as the pay was sufficient and the risks seemed acceptable. Gentlemen, Crowther addressed his assembled forces with the calm precision of a businessman, outlining quarterly projections to his board of directors. We find ourselves facing a convergence of circumstances that threatens the continued profitability and viability of our various enterprises throughout this territory. He spread a hand-drawn map across the poker table, where they had gathered, marking key locations with the methodical care of a general planning a military campaign against a well-entrenched enemy. Our strategic objectives are threefold: eliminate all witnesses who possess knowledge of our operations, recover or destroy all documentary evidence of our activities, and demonstrate to any future potential interference that such actions carry unacceptable personal consequences. One of the hired guns, a scarred man named Briggs, who had deserted from the cavalry after killing an officer in a dispute over gambling debts, raised a practical concern that showed more tactical thinking than Crowther had expected from such men. What about those federal marshals can't exactly shoot badge-wearing federals without bringing the whole territorial government down on our heads like the wrath of God? An excellent observation that demonstrates proper strategic thinking. Crowther replied with the smooth confidence of someone who had anticipated this exact objection and prepared a solution that satisfied both practical and legal concerns. Which is precisely why our operations must be conducted in such a manner that responsibility for any unfortunate casualties falls on the appropriate parties rather than on legitimate businessmen defending their property. Apache raids have been known to leave no survivors after all, and federal marshals who venture into hostile territory during times of Indian unrest must accept the natural consequences of such dangerous duty. The implication was unmistakably clear. They would massacre everyone at Owl Canyon and arrange the physical evidence to suggest a coordinated Apache attack, eliminating both the human witnesses and the documentary proof, while deflecting official suspicion away from the real perpetrators and toward convenient scapegoats who could not defend themselves against false accusations. As Crowther's killers rode toward Owl Canyon through the breaking dawn, their horses' hooves raising clouds of dust that marked their passage across the desert landscape, Marshal Harrison and his federal officers were already in position around the natural amphitheater, studying the terrain and planning their approach to what they expected would be a straightforward evidence recovery operation conducted with proper legal authority. Harrison surveyed the canyon through his military field glasses, noting with growing concern the obvious signs of extensive recent activity that had transformed what should have been pristine wilderness into something resembling an industrial operation. Wheel ruts from heavy wagons scarred the approaches to the canyon entrance, while the remains of several large campfires and the foundations of temporary wooden structures told a story of systematic use for purposes that had nothing to do with legitimate mining or ranching activities. This situation is considerably worse than we anticipated based on the initial reports, he said quietly to his deputies, his voice carrying the grim recognition of a lawman who had seen enough criminal operations to understand their implications. We're not just looking at territorial crimes here. This appears to be a federal case involving interstate commerce, systematic violation of basic human rights, and organized criminal activity on a scale that requires immediate intervention at the highest levels. Below in the canyon, the true scope and sophistication of Crowther's operations became apparent as the federal officers worked their way carefully through the maze of structures and equipment that had been assembled over months of systematic criminal activity. Wooden buildings housed stolen goods waiting for transport to markets in distant territories, where their origins could not be easily traced, while corrals held horses and cattle-bearing brands that had been obviously altered with the crude tools of the professional rustler. Storage areas contained weapons, ammunition, and supplies sufficient to outfit a small army, while carefully maintained ledgers documented transactions and movements with the precision of a legitimate business operation. The scope and organization of the criminal enterprise was staggering in its complexity and efficiency, representing years of careful planning and substantial financial investment. But it was the human element of Crowther's operation that made the scene truly horrifying and transformed what might have been merely a case of organized theft into something that violated every principle of civilized behavior. Chained to stakes, driven deep into the ground near the sacred spring, were 6 young women in various states of malnutrition and despair, their eyes holding the hollow look of people whose spirits had been systematically broken through months of brutalization designed to crush any hope of resistance or escape. Sweet, merciful heaven. One of the younger deputies whispered, his face pale with shock at the evidence of systematic cruelty and dehumanization. How long have they been keeping people in conditions like this? How many others have suffered similar treatment? Harrison's expression grew grimmer. With each detail he observed his professional composure tested by the scope of human suffering that had been deliberately inflicted for profit and convenience. Long enough for them to perfect their methods and expand their operations, he replied, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding what they had discovered. This isn't the work of common criminals driven by desperation or opportunity. This is an organized enterprise that's been operating systematically for years with sufficient resources and protection to avoid detection by territorial authorities who should have been investigating reports of disappearances and suspicious activities. Helene's voice, now strong and clear with righteous anger, cut through the horrified silence that had fallen over the federal officers. My sister Liesel, is she among the captives? She's 18 years old with blonde hair and blue eyes, taken from our home while I was preparing for my wedding to Robert. Harrison studied the imprisoned women through his field glasses, comparing their faces to the description Helene had provided while trying to maintain the professional detachment necessary for effective law enforcement. I can't make a positive identification from this distance, Miss Muller, but I give you my solemn word that we're going to get every one of these women to safety and ensure they receive proper medical care and protection. As the federal officers prepared to descend into the canyon and begin the complex process of evidence collection and victim rescue, Crowther's forces were taking positions on the rim above using the same high ground that should have given the legitimate authorities a tactical advantage. The rancher himself had come to oversee this final operation, personally understanding with crystal clarity that his entire future depended on its success and that failure would mean certain death at the end of a hangman's rope. Remember your instructions precisely, he told his assembled killers with the cold precision that had made him wealthy and feared throughout the territory. No survivors means no witnesses to contradict our version of events. Make it appear consistent with Apache rating patterns, but be absolutely thorough in your work. Every person in that canyon must be eliminated, and every piece of potentially incriminating evidence must be destroyed completely to prevent any future complications or investigations. The attack, when it finally came, caught the federal officers completely off guard despite their military training and combat experience. They had expected to face desperate criminals attempting to escape with stolen property, not a coordinated military-style assault from multiple directions, simultaneously conducted by men who understood tactics and had prepared their positions with careful attention to fields of fire and escape routes. Marshal Harrison's first indication of trouble was the distinctive crack of rifles from the canyon rim, followed immediately by the deadly whistle of bullets striking the rocks around his position. With the accuracy that spoke of professional marksmanship rather than random shooting, his years of experience in frontier law enforcement took over instantly, as survival instincts honed by countless dangerous encounters activated his training. "Take cover immediately. We're under coordinated attack from the rim," he bellowed to his scattered men, his voice carrying the authority of a veteran commander who had led troops through similar situations and understood the crucial importance of rapid response to unexpected threats. But Crowther had planned his assault with the tactical sophistication of someone who understood both terrain and his opponent's likely responses to various scenarios. While his main force provided devastating covering fire from above, smaller groups worked their way down the canyon walls using paths that only longtime residents would know, seeking to trap the federal officers between multiple sources of accurate shooting that would make effective defense nearly impossible. It was during this chaotic opening phase of what would become known as the Battle of Owl Canyon that Dawson proved his worth as both a warrior and tactician, using his intimate knowledge of Apache fighting methods and his understanding of the terrain to organize an effective defense against what seemed like overwhelming odds. The high ground can be neutralized and turned against them, he told Harrison during a brief lull in the intense shooting, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had survived countless similar situations through superior tactics rather than superior firepower. "Their positions are static. They cannot move to pursue advantages without exposing themselves to counterfire from defenders who know this terrain intimately." "What specific action do you recommend?" Harrison asked, recognizing competence and tactical thinking when he encountered it, regardless of its source or the racial prejudices that might normally affect such decisions. "Young Tokala knows climbing paths up the north wall that exist nowhere else in this entire region." Dasan replied, checking his ammunition supply with the practiced efficiency of a warrior who understood that every cartridge might mean the difference between victory and death. "If he can reach the rim with 2 of your best marksmen, they can create crossfire that will force the attackers to choose between multiple targets and divide their attention." Harrison nodded with the decisive authority of a commander who recognized sound tactical advice. "Make it happen. Take whoever you need from my men and coordinate your movements with our defensive positions to maximize the effectiveness of your flanking maneuver." The climbing operation that followed tested every skill that young Tokala had acquired during his years growing up in Apache territory, complicated by the throbbing wound in his thigh that made each handhold an exercise in pain management and iron will. But his warrior's pride would not allow him to fail when innocent lives depended on his success and the honor of his people was at stake. "This is for all the sacred springs they have polluted with their greed," he muttered through gritted teeth as he led 2 federal deputies up a nearly vertical rock face that offered handholds barely visible to untrained eyes. "For all the women they have stolen and treated like cattle to be bought and sold." Their appearance on the canyon rim behind Crowther's main force created exactly the kind of tactical disruption that Dasan had predicted, catching the attackers in a deadly crossfire that forced them to abandon their carefully chosen positions in favor of whatever inadequate cover they could find. Professional killers accustomed to having every advantage suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against opponents who had turned their own tactical superiority against them. But Lucian Crowther was far from finished with his desperate gamble for survival and continued criminal success. As his assault began to falter under the unexpected resistance and superior tactics of the combined Apache federal force, he implemented the most extreme part of his contingency plan, the complete destruction of Owl Canyon, through massive explosive charges that would eliminate all evidence while burying any survivors under thousands of tons of rock and debris. Barrels of black powder had been positioned throughout the canyon during the weeks when his organization had controlled the area, connected by an intricate network of fuses that led to a central detonation point where he could trigger the entire sequence from relative safety while ensuring that the explosion would be devastating enough to obliterate all traces of his criminal activities. Light the fuses immediately. He screamed to his surviving men, abandoning all pretense of tactical control in favor of immediate and total destruction that would solve all his problems through the simple expedient of eliminating everyone who could testify against him. Burn it all to the ground. Leave nothing standing that could incriminate us. The explosion that followed shook not just the canyon, but the entire surrounding area, a man-made earthquake that brought down avalanches of rock, while sealing some passages and opening others in the chaotic redistribution of geological forces that had been stable for millennia. Fire and smoke filled the air as Crowther's stockpiled munitions detonated in a chain reaction that turned the peaceful canyon into a hellish landscape of destruction and death that resembled nothing so much as a vision of the apocalypse. But the blast that was intended to eliminate all witnesses and evidence instead created the confusion and chaos needed for the rescue of the captive women who had been chained near the spring. In the pandemonium of falling rocks, billowing smoke, and secondary explosions, Helene led a desperate effort to reach the imprisoned women before the continuing destruction could complete Crowther's work of total annihilation. This way, follow my voice. She called out her words now, carrying the absolute authority of someone who had found her true purpose in the crucible of crisis and discovered reserves of strength she had never known she possessed. We can get you out of here, but you have to trust me and move quickly. The women's response ranged from disbelief, born of months of systematic brutalization, to desperate hope that freedom might actually be possible after all their suffering. Among them, barely recognizable after weeks of deliberate starvation and abuse designed to break her spirit completely, was Liesl Miller. Her once golden hair, now lank and unwashed, her bright blue eyes hollow with suffering, but miraculously still alive, despite everything that had been done to her. Liesl. Helene's cry of recognition and joy cut through the chaos like a beacon of hope in the midst of destruction. I'm here, I found you, and I'm going to get you out of this nightmare. The reunion between the sisters was both heartbreaking and inspiring, marked by their shared understanding of how much both had changed since their last meeting, and how their innocence had been destroyed by exposure to evil that neither had imagined possible in their sheltered previous lives. But there was no time for extended emotional reconnection, and the canyon was still collapsing around them with each new explosion, and survival required immediate action, coordinated with military precision. It was Dawson who provided the leadership needed to organize their escape, using his warrior's knowledge of terrain and tactical movement to guide the rescued women through passages that offered protection from both the ongoing geological collapse and the sporadic gunfire from Crowther's surviving men who were still trying to complete their mission of total elimination. Stay low to avoid flying debris, move quickly, but do not panic. He instructed the group with calm authority that cut through their fear and confusion. Panic kills more surely than bullets or falling rocks. Trust in your own strength and follow where I lead without question or hesitation. The escape route he chose took them through a maze of passages that seemed to exist more in Apache memory than physical reality paths that his people had used for generations to move unseen through territory controlled by enemies. Each twist and turn was calculated to provide maximum protection while moving them steadily towards safety, even as the continuing explosions made the very ground beneath their feet unreliable. The final confrontation came as they emerged from the canyon's maze of passages, only to find Lucian Crowther himself blocking their path to freedom. The rancher stood with a rifle in his hands and madness blazing in his pale blue eyes, His expensive clothes torn and burned by the explosions, he had triggered his silver hair singed by flames, but his grip on his weapon remaining deadly steady despite the chaos surrounding him. You should have accepted the natural order of things and minded your own business, he said, his cultured voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had finally abandoned all pretense of sanity and embraced the logic of total destruction. I offered civilization to this territory structure purpose, profitable enterprise that benefited everyone willing to participate in progress. Instead, you chose primitive chaos and meaningless sentiment over practical advancement. He raised the rifle to point directly at Helene's head, with the precision of someone who had killed before and felt no moral restraint against killing again. All of this destruction, all of these deaths, all of this waste. It's the direct result of your interference with legitimate business operations. Those women you're trying to save were serving a useful economic function in my organization, contributing to territorial development and prosperity. Now they're simply resources wasted on the illusion of meaningless freedom that will benefit no one. But before he could pull the trigger and end Helene's life along with his own problems, Deputy Marcus Webb appeared from an unexpected direction, moving with the desperate courage of a man who had finally found his moral center after months of compromise and cowardice. His broken wrist was forgotten in the intensity of the moment as he faced the man who had corrupted him and threatened his family. "Drop that weapon right now, Crowther," Webb said with steady determination, his own gun drawn and ready, despite the tremor in his voice that spoke of fear overcome by righteous anger. "Your criminal empire is finished. Your men are dead or captured. The territorial authorities have enough evidence to convict you 10 times over, and there's nowhere left for you to run or hide." Crowther's laugh was the sound of a man who had finally lost all connection to reality and embraced the freedom that comes with having nothing left to lose. "You think I fear execution or imprisonment, Deputy? I've been living on borrowed time for years, managing risks and calculating odds that would break the minds of lesser men. But if I'm destined for the gallows or a territorial prison, I'll take as many of these moral crusaders and their primitive allies with me as possible." The shot that followed echoed through the canyon like thunder, but it was not Crowther's rifle that fired the decisive bullet. Marshal Daniel Harrison, positioned on a rocky ledge above, with the precision rifle he had carried since his service in the Civil War, ended the rancher's threat with the accuracy of a professional marksman who understood the value of a clean kill that would prevent further bloodshed. As the smoke finally began to clear and the last echoes of destruction faded into the desert silence, the full scope of what they had accomplished became apparent to everyone who had survived the battle. More than 20 kidnapped women had been rescued from conditions that violated every principle of human decency, while the criminal organization that had terrorized the territory for years lay in complete ruins with its leaders dead or facing certain execution. Sheriff Claude Thorne, captured during the federal raid on Willow Springs while attempting to destroy evidence in his office, would face trial for murder conspiracy and violations of federal law that would certainly result in his hanging before a crowd of citizens who had suffered under his corrupt administration. The documentary evidence recovered from various hiding places throughout the canyon, and the town provided an irrefutable record of crimes that reached into multiple territories and involved systematic corruption at the highest levels of local government, ensuring that justice would finally be served after years of impunity. But for Helene, the most important victory was deeply personal. The reunion with her sister Liesel in Dr. Whitaker's expanded medical facility, where the rescued women were receiving comprehensive care and beginning the long, difficult process of psychological healing under the guidance of specialists who understood the particular trauma of trafficking survivors. "I thought you were dead," Liesel whispered, her voice barely audible, after weeks of systematic brutalization designed to break her spirit and eliminate any hope of rescue or escape. "When they told me about Robert, when they described what they claimed had happened to you while you were trying to get away. Helene's response came from a strength she had discovered within herself during the darkest moments of her ordeal, a resilience forged in the fire of loss and tempered by the determination to transform suffering into purpose. I survived because you needed me to survive, because Robert's memory deserved justice, and because other innocent people were depending on someone to speak for them when they couldn't speak for themselves. Atatat, the nightmares still come every night, Liesel said quietly, her eyes holding the haunted look of someone who had seen too much of human cruelty and would carry those scars forever. They told us stories about what happened to girls who tried to fight back, who tried to escape or resist their orders. The things they described. Then we'll face those nightmares together. Helene replied with fierce determination, taking her sister's trembling hands in her own. And we'll help other survivors face their demons as well, because there's strength in shared experience and healing in helping others find their way back to hope. As autumn settled over the desert landscape, painting the vast spaces in brilliant shades of gold and red that seemed to celebrate the triumph of justice over corruption, the transformation of Willow Springs became a symbol throughout the territory of what could be accomplished when ordinary people refused to accept evil as inevitable and found the courage to fight for what was right. The new sheriff was a former cavalry sergeant named William Porter, whose integrity was beyond question and whose military experience had prepared him to deal with the complex challenges of frontier law enforcement. Federal oversight ensured that the systematic mistakes of the past would not be repeated, while new policies protected witnesses and encouraged citizens to report suspicious activities without fear of retaliation. Dr. Paul Whitaker expanded his medical practice to include specialized treatment for trauma survivors, drawing on techniques he had learned during the war, but adapting them for the particular needs of trafficking victims who required both physical and psychological healing. The human spirit is remarkably resilient, he explained to visitors who came to study his methods. But recovery requires patience, understanding, and the knowledge that the survivor is surrounded by people who will never again allow them to be victimized. Beatrice Ward found new purpose in her role as legal advocate for the survivors, using her education and knowledge of territorial law to help them navigate the complex process of rebuilding their lives while ensuring that their rights were protected throughout their recovery. Her own experience with Thorne's abuse gave her unique insight into the psychology of both victims and perpetrators, making her an invaluable resource for law enforcement and social services. For too long, women in this territory have been treated as property to be bought, sold, and disposed of, according to the convenience of men who viewed them as less than human. She told a gathering of territorial officials who had come to investigate the scandal and implement reforms. That era ends now with this generation, and we will ensure that it never returns. Young Tokala, his wound healed and his reputation enhanced by his crucial role in the rescue operation, accepted a position as cultural liaison between the Apache tribes and territorial government. His experience had matured him far beyond his years, teaching him that true leadership required wisdom, patience, and the ability to build bridges between different peoples, rather than simply proving his courage in battle. My grandfather always said that the strongest warrior is one who fights to protect others rather than to glorify himself. He told Dasan, as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors from their traditional viewpoint on Red Mesa. I think I finally understand what he meant and why some victories are worth any sacrifice required to achieve them. For Dasan himself, the victory represented far more than personal satisfaction or the resolution of immediate threats to his people's safety. It marked a fundamental turning point in the relationship between Apache communities and the white settlers who continue to arrive in ever-increasing numbers, proving that cooperation and mutual respect were possible when both sides chose justice over prejudice. The old ways and the new ways do not have to be enemies locked in eternal conflict. He observed to Marshal Harrison during one of their regular meetings to discuss ongoing security and cooperation issues. There is room in this vast land for different peoples with different traditions if they choose to share the bounty rather than fight over every scrap like starving dogs. Harrison, whose respect for the Apache warrior had grown considerably during their shared trials, nodded with genuine agreement. You've proven that honor and courage aren't limited by race or culture, Destined. Maybe it's time for more folks in this territory to learn that lesson and act accordingly. But it was Helene who experienced the most profound transformation of anyone involved in the epic struggle. Standing once again at the edge of Willow Springs, as winter approached, bringing crisp air and the promise of snow in the high country, she marveled at how completely her world had changed since that terrible day when Thorn's violence had shattered her peaceful existence and forced her to discover strength she never knew she possessed. The physical scars on her throat had faded to barely visible marks, but the inner strength she had found remained as solid and permanent as the desert bedrock beneath her feet. Her voice, when she chose to use it, now carried an authority that commanded attention and respect from everyone who heard it, and the product of trials that had tested her to her absolute limits and proven her capable of far more than she had ever imagined. "You found your voice in more ways than one," Destined observed as he approached on his white Appaloosa, leading a second horse carefully selected for its gentle nature and steady temperament. "I've found my purpose," Helene corrected, mounting her horse with the easy confidence of someone who had learned to read the moods and needs of animals as well as people. Robert died believing that justice was possible in this territory, that good people could triumph over corruption if they had the courage to stand up and fight for what was right. I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that he was absolutely correct in that belief. Liesel, despite the trauma she had endured and the long road to recovery that still lay ahead, had shown remarkable resilience and determination in her healing process. Her spirit, though wounded, had not been broken, and she had channeled her experience into a fierce commitment to helping other survivors find their way back to hope and dignity. "I want to work with Dr. Whitaker and Miss Ward," she told her sister with quiet determination that spoke of inner strength that no amount of abuse could completely destroy. "I want to help other women find their voices again, the way you helped me rediscover mine. I want to make sure that what happened to us never happens to anyone else, and that the people who commit such crimes face the full consequences of their actions." As they rode together toward the Apache settlement that had offered them sanctuary during their darkest hours, the setting sun painted their shadows long across the desert floor, while the first evening stars began to appear in the vast dome of sky that stretched endlessly above the American West. Behind them lay the graves of those who had died in the struggle for justice, Robert Keller, Henry Lowe, and others whose sacrifice had made victory possible, and whose memory would inspire future generations to continue the fight against corruption and cruelty, wherever it might appear. Ahead stretched the promise of tomorrow, and the endless possibility that lay waiting in the vast spaces of a land that was finally learning to live up to its potential for freedom, justice, and opportunity for all people, regardless of their background or circumstances. The story that had begun with violence and enforced silence in a corrupt sheriff's office had ended with clear voices raised in triumph and determination, proving that the human spirit could overcome even the most systematic attempts to break it. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that healing was possible for individuals, for communities, and for an entire territory that was finally ready to embrace justice over convenience and human dignity over profit. In this harsh but ultimately honest land, where actions mattered more than words and character was tested daily against unforgiving elements, they had discovered not just survival, but transformation. Not just rescue, but the power to rescue others in turn. And not just justice, but the eternal promise that good would ultimately triumph over evil. If people of conscience had the courage to stand up and fight for what they knew to be right.